Hello there. Welcome to the second day of Creator Mass 2019. Thank you, Polly. Where we go through the process of making Christmas themed items for IMVU. So yesterday we made this little bow and bow tie. So we can get a bit closer to that. So what we're going to do today is follow on from that. We're going to make something very similar, almost identical actually, but we're going to pay attention to how the object is UV mapped, because this texture, UV editing, is a very, very simple ribbon texture. But what happens if you want to add some text to it? Not that one, that one. So let's say you had some text, some graphics or patterns that you wanted to add to your item. But if you do that with this, it's going to get all smushed up. So we can take a look at that. So what we're going to do is just quickly replace this image with the, there it is, create a mass, and apply that. Oh, it's worked a bit better than I thought it would. Let's see if we can get a bit closer to that. So it's worked okay around the neck bit. Not quite sure what you call that, the necktie bit, but on the actual bow it's a bit scrunched up, and that's because the UV maps for the bow are quite scrunched up themselves. So let me select that. So if I select those elements, select linked, we can see that the bow is contained within the boundary of the texture. So this is the texture's boundary, the edge. And if you scrunch all of the UVs into that small space, it's going to do the same thing to your texture. So when you're unwrapping your objects, when you're UV mapping them, you have to pay attention to how the UVs are, how they fit the available texture space that you've got in order for it to show correctly in IMVU. So even though just looking at that more closely, even though the neck bit looks okay, that still has a little bit of stretching in it, which is distorting the texture. So what we're going to do is make another bow and maybe do an armband perhaps, or a wristband. But we're going to use this new texture. The purple one. Where's the purple one? I'm going to use this. So let's make a ribbon. So we're going to start with a new project. New, general, don't save. So we're starting with, this is the default Blender scene. And again, if you're not familiar with Blender, you can use your mouse button, middle mouse button, to do all the moving around. So middle click rotates, shift middle click pans or strays or translates, and then control middle click zooms. But if you find using your mouse that way difficult, you can always just use the manipulation tools in the top right corner, and all you need to do there is left click drag and it'll do the same thing. So left click drag in there, that rotates, we can click on the cardinal axes points, and then we've got left click to zoom, left click drag, and then on the pan or the hand icon, left click drag, and that pans or translates the scene. So let me just do that again. General. Right, so we've got our default cube, and that's all we're going to start with. That's all we need. So switch to edit mode. Up top, edit mode. We want to switch to face select. These are our selection tools. So we have vertex, edge, and face. Let's click that, and we've got our faces highlighted. We just need to select 3 of these. So click, hold down shift, click, hold down shift, click. That's a multi-selection, so shift click. And depending on whether you have your left or right mouse button set up as your selection method, you'll get that option the first time you open Blender. So once you do that, it's just a question of clicking whatever you want to select with your left or right mouse. So select those 3. And where is it? Mesh, delete. And we want faces. So we start our bow with this very, very simple C shape. So what we can do is switch to edge select, select the top edge, switch to the manipulators, the move manipulator, and just bring that down. And that is the very basic starting point of our bow. Next, add a loop cut. So use the loop cut tool. Click that. And if you move the mouse over one of the edges, you'll see there's a yellow indicator, and that's telling us the orientation the cut will take. So if you mouse over a horizontal edge, it'll result in a vertical cut, because what you're doing is actually splitting the edge. If you do the same thing over a vertical edge, you'll get a horizontal indicator, because again, we're actually splitting that edge that's been highlighted. So we want a vertical one, so click there. That's all we need to do. To disengage the tool, click the manipulators. For some reason, you can't deactivate the tool by clicking it to activate and then click again to deactivate. That doesn't work, so you have to select a tool. Then, oh, still in edge mode, that's okay. And all we do is click, select the edges, and just move them in to create a relieved ribbon, essentially. We can make this a bit more round, add another couple of loop cuts. So activate the loop cut tool again. Come on tool, clickety click, there we go. Click, click, we just need 2. And then manipulate. Shift click. Then switch to Vertex, so we can select individual vertices. And we can make some changes to the bow. So that's very simple and quite straightforward. So you start with a cube, delete 3 faces, drop the leading edge, the one that was up here, add a loop cut, that'll create your relief, and then you can add another 2 or 3 to soften the shape. So what we want to do now is duplicate this. So exit edit mode, back into object mode. Object, and we want duplicate linked. And what this does, so we've got our object created, right click just to, or press escape, and that'll just release it. That's created an exact duplicate of the mesh, and this will come in handy for object, mirror, and this is on the, is this the y-axis? Yes, the y-axis this time. Just position both of them on either side of the center line. So why we duplicated, but we've created a linked duplicate, is because we can edit one and it'll change the other. So this is a very handy way of manipulating multiple objects that are supposed to be similar without editing multiple objects individually. So what we're going to do is make this a little bit less spiky. So we're shift clicking. So we click the individual vertex and then shift click to select multiples. And all we're doing is just softening the shapes a little bit. That's okay. Exit edit mode, object mode. What we want to do now is add the middle bit. So we're going to do that with add mesh cube. We want to shrink this down, so we're going to use the scale widget. Come on, widgets. Doesn't like button selecting whilst streaming. So we've got the scale widget. What we're going to do is just resize this cube a little bit. So that's left click drag inside the looped area. And what that does is it scales universally on all axes. Whereas the handles, the coloured handles, will scale only on the axis that it represents. Or multiple axes in the case of this new feature that we've got. I'm going to shape this now. Edit mode. I want to shrink the top a little bit. Add some loop cuts. So 1, 2. So we're moving the mouse over these leading edges in order to get the loop cut to go across the mesh. And then with that, what we can do is click, click, scale, click, shift click, and scale. So we want to scale these selections in those directions, so we use the appropriate axis of the widget, which is the green handle. Vertex, and just grab that middle one and pull that up just to make it a little more round. Right, so those are the basic elements of our bow. So we can reposition these a little bit. So what we've got are two ribbon sections and a central knot section, and they are just basic simple shapes. As we saw, the ribbons just start out as cubes and the center just starts out as a cube, and it's just a question of adding some very, very simple cuts, some simple shaping, and we've already got something that's starting to look like a bow. So what we can do next is make our side pieces look more bow-like. Edit mode, vertex. So select those two outer vertices and scale those inwards. So we use the red handle because we want these to be scaled along the axis. And then do the others to get the shape that we want. And note that the other side is also being changed as we do that. Right, so we now need to do a little bit of shaping. Because some of these are a bit aggressive. Scale. And there we have a very simple bow. So what we need to do now is object mode. Just do a quick check. Whoops, we've got a bit of clipping. This section that's showing here is the bottom clipping through the top, so we need to watch out for those. Back into edit mode. So is that vertex there? Yeah. So when you're placing your vertexes or positioning them, so we've got our central knot, that's this big section. And we want to bury the edges inside this other object, but we don't want to go too deep, because if we vertex paint this later, what will happen is that there'll be a, what's the word, disparity. Well, we'll go over this with vertex painting, but the colors change from vertex colors are painted to the vertices of a mesh, and they spread based on the arrangement of vertexes. So if you get your colors too intense on one spot, the bleed may be quite strong from one vertex than it is from another, because of the distance and the strength of color. So this edge is longer than this edge. So if you use the same color, the same tone, let's say 100% dark on both points, where these 2 points intersect, there's going to be a difference between those 2 areas of the mesh. And we've got to be careful when we position our vertexes to either take advantage of that or try and avoid or mitigate problems that might occur. So when we are placing our vertexes together and burying them inside something, we have to keep in mind what other things we might be doing to the mesh later on. So we can position these vertexes just inside the mesh. Do that for both sides. It should be okay. Right, so with that done, let's add some smoothing to smooth out the mesh. So object, shade smooth. That smooths both of them, makes them look a bit more organic. And the center. Oh, we can get rid of that bottom face because we don't need it. So shift click, mesh, delete faces, and you'll note, undo that, note how the shading changes as well. So these are all tips that help the appearance of your meshes, not just your products, but if you're doing other things as well. These little tips are things that you won't see people talking about because it's considered to be a non-issue, but these little things, these are the bits that really make your products or your meshes pop in IMVU in your game. Because if we look at the way that let's turn this back to, let's revert this, whoops. So if we go back to flat shaded, so smoothing, there's an article on a tutorial on Cat Spits about this, but shading is basically at the moment the default is that every face is treated as an individual independent surface in its own right. What smoothing does is it joins that, it doesn't join them together, it treats the surfaces as though they are part of a larger group. So if we smooth this, all the surfaces, all the hard edges disappear because all those surfaces are now part of a larger group, and what that does is it spreads the illumination across the surfaces, so we lose these hard edges that we had when we had faceted enabled. But the problem with that is that if the mesh is closed, so this central object that we've got selected is a closed object, so every face is part of the same group, and that changes the smoothing behavior. So if we get rid of the bottom faces, right, they're still selected, so if we watch what this area does here that's dark, and it's all the way around the back of the mesh as well, so if you watch what happens there when we remove those, it changes the behavior of the lighting or the shading of the mesh. That's because the surface continuity has been broken by the removal of those surfaces. They're not needed, so you can get rid of them. I've got a couple of faces that we need to fix there. Whoops, wrong object. The ribbon. And that's another thing that you want to watch out for. So as well as the vertex colors, you need to watch out for the proximity of your vertices object to object. Because not only are we having to contend with color differentiation, we've also got to contend with the way the mesh shades. So as we can see from the inside here, the vertexes just intersect the knot ever so slightly. And on the other side we can do that by object mode. We change the position of the object. We don't edit the mesh because this is a duplicate. Right, so there's our very simple bow. Save the file, save as, create, whoops, bow. Save as. Right, so next we need to add a material. So we need to be in material properties. So the default cube that we had to start with has a material assigned to it, but the cube that we added doesn't. So we can use the material that was already included, and we can set up a shader for that. Preview. So at the moment it's just blank, so go into shading workspace, and we should have, yes we do, we have a basic material, and all materials have these two nodes to start with. So whenever you create one in material properties, we'll have these two nodes dropped in by default. So that's principled BSDF and material output. So for IMVU we just need a very simple basic material. For that, we just add texture, image texture. And this is an image texture node, and this is the node into which our images, our external images, generally speaking, will be associated. So we can either create a new one, which is just a temporary generated image, or we can click open and find, there it is, our bow, is that the one? Our bow texture. So select open image, and then to connect them to the material, click drag color to base color. And as that had a basic UV map assigned to it already, the texture has appeared. But we need to change that, so select the middle one and we can assign the material that we just created to that. So material properties, and then we want the browse material button. There is our material. We can rename this actually, so ribbon square brackets 0 close square brackets 0. That's our IMVU compatible material. So what we need to do now is edit the UV maps. So for that we go into UV editing. Switch to, so these are our display modes. We're in solid at the moment, that one, but we can use material preview or rendered, and that shows the material and the texture. So let's unwrap this object that we've got selected. So we're in edit mode. I think it does that by default. Select all. That's an odd shape. And then from the UV menu, just unwrap. Oh, let's do that again. What was that error message? Object has non-uniform scale. Unwrap will operate as a non-scaled version of the... Do that again. Non-scaled version of the mesh. That's fine. So to address that, object mode, what we need to do, because that should show, yes. So because we manipulated the object in object mode and we smushed it and changed its width and height, that's created an odd scaling across the mesh. So we've got an X and a Y and a Z or Z that are different from one another. We need to unify those. So from the object menu, we want apply, then rotation and scale, or all transforms. And if we look, whoops, if we look at the scaling now, they're all 1. That's what we want. So let's do that to the ribbons as well, just to make sure. Oh, it won't do it yet because we're using a duplicated mesh. Yeah, so we get a warning. Cannot apply to multi-user object cube, mesh cube. So we'll come back to those. So let's unwrap that again. There we go. Excuse me. So which way on is this? So this is the transform widget. So on the left we have the UV image editor. On the right we have the 3D view. Both of them have the same or similar manipulation tools. But in the UV image editor, although we have the different, so that's move, rotate and scale, we have the same widgets, move, rotate and scale, but you'll note that there isn't an actual widget in the image editor unless transform is selected, and that brings us up this widget. And the way this works, each of the edges is a transformation edge, so too are the corner nodes, and so too is this little node that points out or pokes out. So the edges transform in the direction that they essentially face. Same with the corner nodes, and then the one at the top, that's a rotate. And if you're watching the 3D view whilst the widget is being manipulated, you can see that the texture is also moving on the mesh. So we can position this relative to how we want the texture to appear. Oh, and then there's this middle bit. That's our transform or translate. Vertexes, and these are our selection modes. So we've got vertex, edges, faces, and then islands. And an island is the entire map section. So let's straighten this UV map out a little bit. So we're selecting individual UV vertices and manipulating the shape. Whoops. That's a bit too big. Let's just keep it off center. So that's that bit. Object mode, select one of the bows, doesn't matter which because they're obviously duplicates. Edit mode, select all so we can see the UV map, which is a bit of a mess. Let's unwrap that, and again, UV menu, unwrap. So we use the widget to edit the UV. So let's see how that's looking. That's looking okay. Switch to vertexes. So that's okay. But what we want to do now, because we don't want, it's a bit clearer, we don't want the two bows to be mirrors of each other. So what we need to do is unlink or detach the two sections from one another so they are unique. So select the duplicate. It doesn't actually matter which one you select, but select the duplicate, object. Now where is this? Apply. No, we have to where's the make unique thing? Let's just try that first. Rotation and scale, we'll get the warning. So what we have to do is make this object unique. There used to be a way of doing that. Don't know where it's gone in Blender 2 point. Oh, there we go. So we want object, relations, we want make single user, and object and data. So object and data is the object itself and the data that's associated with it. If we do object data and materials, what that will do is duplicate the material and create a new instance of the same material that we actually want to use. So we don't want this one, you just want object and data. Selected objects. Okay, so that's created a unique instance. So if we look at this, whoops. So we've got cube, and if we click on the other one, that is now cube.001. I think it was 001 before, but that's now a unique object. So if we go back into object, apply, it should now create us a separate object, which we can now change the UV map for. And it should change. Yep, it does. Perfect. So let's change this. So we need to flip this. So that's left, right, up, down. So which way around are we? Mirror. Oh, there we go. So create a mass. Let's see if we can get text to go across all three objects. So create a mass. That's going to be about there. That will be about there. Although that looks a bit goofy, so let's undo that. So Control Z. And that is our basic bow. So back to layout. Yeah, so that's our basic bow. Let's save this. File, save as. To so what we've basically done here is recreated the bow that we had before. Let's just put that back to the red one. But because we've added text to the image and we want it to appear properly on the mesh, we've paid more attention to the UV map of the object so that it's mapped properly to the object. That's a very shiny surface. Shader, specular, turn that off. There we go, that's easier to see now. So what we can do now, let's make this a wrist ribbon. So it'll be on the wrists of the avatar. So what we want to do now is add mesh cylinder, and in the cylinder properties box at the bottom, reduce the number of vertices, click, want 8, although for the arms I think it's actually 6, but let's just go with 8 for now. Radius, that's fine for now. Depth, that's fine for now. Cap fill type, we want nothing, so that opens the top and the bottom because we don't need those surfaces. It's going to generate some UVs, we can use those, so leave that active, and then that's okay for the rest of it. So let's rotate this. Hold Control whilst doing that and it'll snap. You'll get these little degree markers, and if you look in the top left corner you see some text and it's giving us a rotational value, so we just want 90. Let's position this. Let's rotate that a little bit, because what we can do is, so that's 20 degrees, is it? No. So position that. Make it a bit thinner. So scale. That's okay. Yeah, that's okay. Object, apply, rotation scale, because again, we've changed the scaling values so they're not, there's a mismatch, so we need to fix that. Object, apply, rotation scale, and they're all the same. Add some smoothing, shade smooth, so that's now more organic in appearance, and then we can apply the same material we've been using. So in material properties, use the material selector or the browse material to be linked, and there is our ribbon. Whoops. And there it automatically appears on the mesh because it's already got a UV map. We need to check that. UV editing. And we don't want it to be quite so stretched. So select. And what you also want to do, so which way round are we? So view, viewpoint, top. So which is the front? View, viewpoint, front. So that's the front. Right. Okay. So can we flip this, rotate that around? Yeah, that works okay. So one of the other things you want to watch out for is if you're shrinking, so the texture is going to be generally set up so that it tiles. So if your UV map is end to end or side to side, top to bottom, so long as you've got your texture set up correctly at these points, not so much at the top and the bottom for this particular type of texture, but if you have those set up correctly, it'll tile without showing any artifacts. But if you start messing around with the UV map, depending on the type of texture you're using, you may very well cause issues. So what you want to try and do with a texture like this, it's pretty easy to do because we've just got a lot of colored areas in between all the patterns, so it's easy to match a color to a color rather than trying to find an area where you are matching a pattern, say that one and that one. So when you're making your textures, try to keep that in mind as well, that although you can tile your textures end to end, that depending on the texture use, you have some patterns or areas that allow you to tile within the actual texture itself. So that's okay for that. That's perfect. Right, so layout, let's save this. File, save as, number 3. Right, so what we can do next is add this or append it to the accessory file. Which I'll drop into the chat. So starter files. So that's where you can get the starter files if you want to learn more about. Oh, that's actually the same page. Yeah, that's fine. So that page also has some information about making projects for IMVU. So, what were we going to do? Oh, starter files. Right, so open the starter file. In this instance, it's on the desktop for moi. Or file, open, and then browse to wherever you've got the file. So if it's on the desktop, in this instance, just browse to it, click it, and then open. Or it saved that. Yes, we did save that. Just save that again. Click, drag, and drop. Open. And there is our accessory starter file. So what we want to do for this is first append or import the assets. Oh, I've actually forgotten to do something. So go back to the other file. So before we actually do that, one thing that we do need to do, select all the meshes and then join them together. So join, so that's object, join, and that creates a single object. We can name this object properties. Let's call it wrist ribbon dot mesh ribbon. Wrist ribbon.mesh. Just save that as a different version so that we don't save over the one with the parts. Right, so now we can load the accessory file. Right, so that's the accessory file. File, append. File browser will pop up. We need to browse to the file that we've just been using, creating. So there it is, creator mass number 4, and then just oh, hang on, no, that's right. So they've changed the way that this works. Yeah, so that's right. So select the file, because when you're appending Blender files, the dot blends, they behave like zip archive files or archive files. So when you click on them, what you're actually doing is accessing the contents of the blend file. So click to access, double click, and then you want the objects folder, double click, and then we have our mesh object. So select and then append. So because of the scale, this always happens. Because of the scale difference between Blender and IMVU, it will look as if nothing has happened, but we can check this two ways. In the outliner, we can see that a new entry has appeared and it's highlighted, which means it's the active object in the scene, and that is our wrist ribbon.mesh. Alternative, so we know the object is in the scene, we just don't know where it is. So the alternative is select, it's not select, it's view frame selected. So click that and Blender will zoom to our object, and it's tiny, so that's our little tiny object. That's the bone at the foot of the avatar. That's the avatar. So it's tiny. So what we need to do is make sure it's selected so we can click it in the outliner. Then the scale widget, and that gives us our widget, and then left click again because we want to scale universally anywhere within the white outline, and just make it big so that we can see it. And then we can use our widgets and move it into position. So that's the transform or translate or move widget. Just roughly position it. Rotate. So what we want to do with the 3D view is rotate around the object itself. At the moment, rotation is offset and it's off kilter. So the way we can address that, from the view menu, you can either use frame selected or frame all. And that will recenter the scene so that we now rotate around the object that we're manipulating. And that makes it much easier to do what we need to do. So switch the widgets around and scale. Another tip, at the moment the widget is orientated. Its cardinal directions are matching the grid, subject to perspective. So we've got the x-axis and the y-axis and the z-axis all matching the grid. So that means the manipulating the object is a tangent. No, what's a tangent? It's parallel to the grid. To make this easier, what we want to do is manipulate the object relative to itself and its current orientation. And we can change that in the transform orientation settings. So we switch that from global to local, and if we watch what happens to the widget, so I'll just draw, so that's where the widget is currently pointing. So we need local, see how the orientation has changed from what it was, which was about that, I guess. Looks like a spider. So that now means the object will manipulate, or can be manipulated, relative to its own position. And that makes it much easier to position. So that's about where it needs to be. So we're using all the widget tools. So using the move to move with the position, change the position, rotate to change its orientation, and then scale just to change its size as a unit. So with that in place, what we can do now is save that file. So we now have a restore point to go back to, and we want to keep the name, so continuing, so select that and then rename that 5. So we now have a continuation of the project. Right, so to turn this into an accessory for the wrist. Now ordinarily you might think it's this bone that's sticking out here, but you'd be wrong, because that's the bone for the hand. What we actually want is the bone up here that's for the wrist. So that bone is not actually the wrist bone. It's not the wrist joint. Well, it is the wrist joint, but it doesn't control the lower arm or the wrist. It controls the hand. So what we want is this bone, or this armature. So this is an accessory. So that's left wrist. So to turn this into an accessory, we need two things. select the object, object data properties. We need to create a vertex group. So click the button, the plus button. That adds group by default. Double click, rename attachment root. The name is case sensitive, so the A and the R are both uppercase. Switch to edit mode. Make sure everything is selected. And then again in vertex groups, we've got these new buttons appearing. Click assign. That assigns the group to the mesh. And we can check that. Deselect and select. So that's step 1. Go back into object mode. Step 2. We want modifiers. Add modifier. And we want an armature modifier. So select that. And to make this easier, particularly if you're doing something like a ring or a necklace where there's a lot of bones or a lot of armatures in close proximity to one another, click the little eyedropper and then click on the armature that you want to use. So click that and it automatically places itself as the object to which the mesh is associated with, and we can check this. So if we select the armature, switch to pose mode, the bones will turn blue. Switch to rotate, that bone does nothing, so undo that. Click to select the other bone, and that should, and it does, it moves the mesh. That's what we want. Exit pose mode. And we are just about ready to export. So let's save a version of this. Save as 6 and then export. Now because this is an accessory, select none, so nothing should be selected in the scene. Then from File, Export, select FBX. So this has changed a little from the previous version of Blender. But the options are still the same. So for accessories, always disable selected objects. Everything else in this section is okay. Transform, we can leave those as the defaults, that's okay. Geometry, we can leave apply modifiers, we can leave that as optional. And then everything else in that section is okay. In armatures, always disable add leaf bones. So deselect that, and then everything else is okay. And then bake animations, because we're not actually animating anything, we can just deselect that and that's fine. We can change the file name if we want, but that's okay. And then just double check, blah de blah blah, and then export. That is our file created. So now we switch over to IMVU. So where is IMVU? IMVU. So create mode. New project. Female accessory. Get the glasses as always. and that is our default project with the glasses. So to import, we go to FBX import, load FBX, then we find the file bow6. Yep, and then open. That brings up the select skeleton root dialog, and we always want the one that starts root node, and that will always generally be 2 bones and 1 mesh, because the armature that we were using in IMVU, not IMVU, the armature we were using in Blender has 2 bones, accessory root and accessory node. So select that. It'll give us our mesh, and then we can click configure, and it brings in the data which we now need to set up for IMVU. So this is female avatar, so we want mesh ID to be 2. Brought in the ribbon, that's fine, that's fine. Scale is 0.01, and then import. So we'll get these warnings, which should be fine. So it's telling us that the scale difference between IMVU and Blender may affect what we see. It generally doesn't, but it's warning us that it might, and it's overriding the default texture that's associated with the glasses, which is 0, so that's fine. So import changes, and then apply changes, and our object is there, but it is going to be inside the head. There it is. Because the default bone is the head bone that the attachment node is used as. So we need to change that to, let's double check this, LF wrist. LF wrist. Enter and apply change, and that should, and there is our wrist ribbon bow thing. Sweet, it's perfect. And it should, if we do RT right, is it RT? Yeah, it's RT. That should switch over without any issues. So there we have the same object. Oh, it's a little offset. That's fine. So if you were, depending on the object or depending on the item, you could have the same item used on the left or the right. But as that's a little, got a little skew if, because we know the avatars aren't perfectly set up. LF, so LF, let's double check that that's okay on that side. Yeah. Yep, perfect. So want this for the male as well, so comma 191. Apply changes, and let's just double check texturing. So let's disable two-sided, because this will show something. Get disable use blending because we're not using any transparencies. Yeah, so that's another thing that we have to watch out for. It's a little tricky to see in IMVU because we can't get too close to the mesh. But the mirrored side, or the mirrored copy of the mesh, is inside out. So in Blender, what we need to do is, now where is it? It's part of materials, I think. Yes, so we select the object, material properties, and then we go down to back face culling. And what that does is it disables the, so it's Blender is rendering both sides of the mesh. We want to disable that, and then we can see that one side is facing the right way, but the other one isn't. So we have to correct that. Faces. So select one face. Then we want select, linked. And then to flip it, we want mesh, normals, and then flip. And it reverts it flips them around the right way up. Exit edit mode. So let's just save over the file, and then we can re-export this. So select none, export FBX. Don't change the file name, we'll just save over the top. So select objects deselected. Geometry, that's okay. Armatures, that's disabled. Bake animations, that's disabled. Export. So bring that back in. FBX import. Oh, actually, let's do a new so we can see the difference. Female accessory. Go. There's the glasses. FBX import, load FBX, and find the file again. Open. Again, root node, 2 bones, 1 mesh. Configure. 2 scale is 0.01. Blah de blah. Everything else is okay, and then just import. Blah de blah blah. Yeah, import. Apply changes. Let's get inside her head. Just to double check. Yep, there it is. Config. LF wrist, and again remember that all these bone names are case sensitive. So there is the bow. Let's disable those just for now. Yep, so there we go. That's right way out. So what we can do now is re-enable two-sided. And there is our wrist bow. What can we do now? Oh yes, so config. What's for the male? So 191. Apply changes. And that is our wrist bow with our UV maps. So in this example, we've spent more time looking at the UV maps and making those fit what we were doing or what we're wanting from the end result. So let's just save that. Save as. Creator Mass 2019 to wrist bow. And then of course it's just upload. So you have to take your product icons, set your price, and then publish. So that's what we did today. So created a bow, but we've paid more attention to the UV maps. So we've paid more attention to the UV maps to make sure that we can get our texture appearing properly without distortion or limited amount of distortion on our object. Whereas before that wasn't too much of a problem to worry about because the texture was just a very plain texture. So we could get away with being very lax with our UV maps. So there we go, another bow, another day, another project. So although this isn't exactly a tutorial per se, hope there was a few tips that were useful. Things to watch out for when you're making things for IMVU in particular that'll help you get the best from whatever it is you're making. So if you want to learn more about using Blender for IMVU, Blender 2.8 in particular, just go to that URL and watch the videos that are available, download the files, and you'll be making stuff quite quickly. Because they're all very simple projects, which is the best way to start. Start with something simple. Get used to the way that Blender works, particularly because of the changes. So again, if you have trouble controlling the mouse, you know, whether that's because you don't have a middle mouse button or you have genuine issues controlling the mouse, just use the scene manipulation tools in the corner. And those will help a lot. And then of course you've got your widgets. Move, rotate, scale, and then the universal that holds them all. One widget to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them. So there we go. Creator Mass Day 2, Project 2, which is a wrist ribbon. So the next one we'll continue again. We'll use ribbons, but we'll make something else with the ribbon. Not quite sure what yet. There's a list of things that we could probably do, but I haven't decided yet. We've even got elf on a shelf, but that's rather complicated. So, hope you enjoyed that, and we shall see you on the next stream. So, cheerio, as they say in not Afghanistan, because we had that yesterday. So, Botswana. So cheerio, as they say in Botswana.